When I first got out of business school, I went to work for Conrail, as Dennis mentioned. And about a year later, I got promoted to kind of a junior manager. And my boss came into me around this time of year and said, Mark, it's budget season. And the big guy, the vice president, his boss, he said, he said, Mark's pretty good with numbers. Why don't we have him coordinate the revenue and the profit goals for next year for our business unit? And I said, yeah, I took a class on planning and budgeting at Wharton. I can do that. So I gathered all the data. I built a model, of revenue and profit model for our business unit. I looked at all the contracts that were going to be coming up in the next year and what our probabilities were of winning these contracts and how much traffic they were going to make. Some investment assumptions about equipment and about logistics systems. And I tied it up in a neat bow, and I gave it to my boss with a lot of pride. It was a work of art. And he didn't react quite as enthusiastically as I thought he would. And he's shaking his head, and I said, is there something wrong with like my data or the model? No, the analytics are wonderful. I just think it's too high. I mean, you're showing 25% revenue growth, 15% revenue growth, 25% profit growth. I don't think the big guy's going to accept this. And I thought, oh, well, that's what your worry is. No, I wouldn't worry about that. The vice president was a kind of type A, hard-charging, gung-ho personality. He'd walk around the office talking about how we're going to hug the customers to death, we're going to crush the competition, we're going to win. I couldn't imagine him worrying about aggressive numbers. And I prevailed upon my boss, probably against his better judgment, to present the plan just the way I had outlined it. And we get to the VP's office, and he looks at it. He goes, number's too high. I mean, have you been in that situation? I'm sure, everyone in here, right? And he explains to me, he goes, Mark, look, whatever numbers we send upstairs to my boss, the CEO, and he sends up to the board, we got to make it. Now, are you 100% certain that we can make these numbers? I said, certain? I mean, we're talking about the future, it's uncertain. Yeah, that's what I thought. So, what number are you certain we can make? I said, certain, 5% profit growth? He goes, that's not big enough. Don't make me look like a wuss. He didn't actually use that word, but you know where I'm going. So at that point, I was kind of indignant at Wharton, in part because in my budgeting and planning class, they never once talked about negotiation, about gamesmanship, about using my information to lead the board down the garden path. Never. And I was kind of overcome with a wave of insubordination that has afflicted me ever since I was a child. And I turn to my vice president, I say, okay, what number do you want? And you can imagine what my boss looked like out of the corner of my eye. But the VP didn't blink. He said 10 to 12%. And sent me up. And that's how I learned what budgeting is like in the real world. So a budget-based bonus plan, the idea is that more of some measure, profit, revenues, whatever, you got one for every measure. And you got a plan that looks something like this. This should look very familiar, right? We got a target. If we make the target, we get some bonus. If we get above target, we get more bonus up to some cap. If we fall short of the target, we get less bonus or nothing at all. What can go wrong? Well, obviously the first thing that can go wrong is what I was just talking about. This creates obviously an incentive to do better than target, but the very first incentive it creates is the incentive for me to understate the potential of my business as a manager, systematically. Now, I know that sandbagging doesn't happen in any of your companies, but the research says it happens pretty much everywhere else, okay? And then we have the cap. At some point, we don't make any more money for additional performance. Now, anyone who's worked in a real company understands what I mean when I say that a cap on bonuses is tantamount to a cap on performance, okay? What happens when you're sailing past the finish line? You pull down your sails, okay? We kind of call that the go golfing point. Now, managers wouldn't, all else being equal, wouldn't really stop here because they got pride, they might have a lot of options, they might keep charging past that cap. And they might even risk the uncomfortable questions that they get afterwards from the board of directors, like, didn't you understand your business as well as we thought you did last year when you gave us these targets and caps? You weren't sandbagging us, were you? But the thing that really drives in the research, I think, the fact that companies don't outperform too far is not what happened with the budget targets from last year is what's going to happen to the budget targets next year. That's what really reins managers in when they're in this area of unrewarded performance. Now, these two facts about budget-based bonus plans, the fact that they create an incentive to understate and underperform the potential of the business, are not even the most dangerous parts. The most dangerous part is what happens at that threshold. Think about what that threshold means. So what that threshold means is if we climb right over it by $1, the company may disperse hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of dollars to the management team. If we fall short by $1, we get nothing. Dennis mentioned I got my degree in aerospace engineering. The reason I went into patent law was because I knew I was not going to make a good engineer. I looked at the people around me in school and I thought, I can't keep up with these guys. I got to do something else. But the one thing that I took away in my aerospace program was you never design an airplane with stress points. Okay, what that means is you got something that's flowing and it's got all these forces flowing over it, and you don't want to ever get to the point where the wing is being held on by 2 rivets. That threshold, where $1 means nothing, another dollar means millions, is a stress point in the bonus plans. One of the classes that I've taught at NYU is called A History of Scandal, and about half of all the scandals, this is the area where the scandals happen. This is where you got deferred maintenance. This is where you've got accounting manipulations. This is where you got managers doing everything they can to get over that hump. This is where all the scandals happen. This is governance risk. About half of all the companies that imploded in the last 20 years did it in that danger zone. Understanding this, and every element of this has got a lot of research behind it, kind of explains why bonus plans, they do create an incentive to perform, but they have a lot of other incentives built into them. And by the way, all of these things that can happen are invisible to the board. These are unobservable behaviors. Unless you're in a small company and you're having daily conversations with management, you can't see these things happening. Now, a very brief history of incentive plan development. In the beginning, starting in 1885 with Procter & Gamble, managers or boards of directors were looking for ways to share the wealth with their employees, to get them motivated, and they created profit-sharing plans. And profit-sharing plans began to spread. Alfred Sloan had a profit-sharing plan at GM, all the way up to, you have an article about Ken Iverson at Nucor, profit-sharing plan. They were the most popular types of plans until about the 1960s. In the 1960s, consultants came along. And consultants, we sell ideas, and our expectation is if you implement our ideas, you're going to make money. You're going to create value. But with a lot of the ideas that we sell, they ended up on the shelf, right? So then consultants decide they need access to the incentive plans. So if you want managers to actually implement the ideas, you tie them to the bonus plan. And when strategic planning grew up to be all the rage in the late 70s and early 80s, McKinsey, Bain, BCG all wanted access to the bonus plans. They said, if you implement the strategy, you'll win, but in order to implement the strategy, you need to tie it to their bonuses. And that's when budget-based plans were born. That's when they began to spread. Now, think about what happened in that shift. A profit-sharing plan, more generally a value-sharing plan, is pretty straightforward. The idea is we've got some threshold level of profit, and we're going to pay, say, 20% of the profits above that threshold level going into the bonus pool. So where is the budget negotiations in a plan that looks like this? Year after year, 20% of the growth in profits. Not there. There's no need to put a cap on this plan. I believe, and I'm not sure if the research supports this, but I believe the caps were basically put in place because boards knew they were being sandbagged, and it was kind of a hedge against being beaten badly too much in the negotiation from the prior year. But profit-sharing plans typically don't have caps. Or if they have caps, they're so far out that they're not going to be triggered unless something really extraordinary happens. And there's no cliff. We start from the first dollar of profit, and every dollar of profit gets us a bigger bonus. But this is the plan that disappeared over the last 20 years. The budget-based bonus plan, which was tied into the strategic planning process, has basically got an entire bureaucracy built around it in every corporation in America. And compensation consultants are no dummies. They saw where things were going, and they began building budget-based planning as basically a synonym for bonus plans. This is just a kind of a sample from the websites of these companies of how they say they build bonus plans. And it's all built around the strategy. They're going to look at the strategy, and this is all code for we're going to take your goals, we're going to create targets, or we're going to verify that's what management's doing. That's how we're going to build bonus plans, and it's entrenched. Psychologists have looked under the senior management levels to see how budget-based bonus plans are actually perceived and how they affect managers. And in psychology, there's a pair of concepts called intrinsic motivation, which is where you identify with the idea, you identify with the goal, and you just want to do it. And extrinsic motivation, which is where somebody's either forcing you or paying you to do something, go from A to B to C. And I've literally heard this as rat in a maze syndrome. And what psychologists have come to believe is that extrinsic motivation can crowd out intrinsic motivation. So it's not just that you're going to get what you pay for, but you're not going to get a lot of other things that you might want as well at the same time. And a value-based plan basically says, this is the end point, this is where we want to be led, you figure out how to get around the obstacles, over, under, around them, as long as we're acting ethically and in compliance with the laws, of course. All right, at this point, let me ask you, how many of your compensation consultants, if you've dealt with them, have told you about any of this? Okay. So I fulfilled on one promise, that you've heard something here that you've never heard before. So I'm going to get now to well, this is just a summary. The implications for the multiple, is aim for value sharing plans if you can. You can't always do it, especially if you're talking about smaller companies, if they're pre-profit, maybe even pre-revenue, you've got to have something else. If you can't have a value sharing plan in place, by the way, use a subjective plan. They actually outperformed budget-based bonus plans, which kind of horrified me when I first learned this. I'm very analytical. I believe in the objective stuff. Here's what you do, you get paid for that. Turns out subjective plans actually outperform budget-based bonus plans as well. So, last part here, part 3. Why isn't your compensation consultant telling you this? Well, it's not entirely their fault. The first reason is because you're not asking them. You're indirect. I've been to hundreds of compensation committee meetings, and I can probably count on one hand the number of times a board of directors has said, Mark, we don't care what anyone else is doing. We want you to design for us a distinctive plan that's going to give us a competitive advantage. I never hear that. What I usually hear is just about the opposite. Mark, what is everyone else doing? And because compensation consultants are really good at this research about what everyone else is doing, we've arrived at a place akin to everyone copying off of everyone else's paper and somehow expecting a decent outcome. But what I think is that this kind of benchmarking is great if you want to know, like, pay. Are we paying in a typical range for that position? Benchmarking research is useful for that. But they benchmark everything. We benchmark cash versus equity, or benchmarking whether we should be given restricted stock or options or performance, things that don't really need to be benchmarked. We don't get any information from that, but we ask, what is everybody else doing? And from my perspective, I think that's actually a recipe for mediocrity. And it's an admission that unlike our operating plan, which we would never benchmark, our marketing plan, we don't look at what other companies do to decide what we're going to do for marketing. In HR, we decide that's what we're going to copy everybody else on. It's like an admission that HR is no longer an area that we can achieve competitive advantage. My opinion, not the research. The second reason they don't tell you, we're all a little bit afraid of ISS, if we're in public companies, okay? And ISS's standards are rather orthogonal to a lot of the stuff I've been talking about. These are some of the, they don't like mega grants. They believe that performance equity is preferable to time-based equity. They of course don't like repricing options. GMI and ISS has adopted this, they want you to use what they call a diversity of metrics across multiple plans. Okay. Now, they won't vote against you for any one or even a combination of these things, but these are just standards that they throw out there. These are things that they consider.
Where are you within the key word is discretion?
Yes.
And the ISS, I would put a fourth bullet, discretion is a bad word.
Exactly. They don't like discretionary plans. I prefer value sharing plans if you can do them. If you can't, then I would say subjective, non-multi-measure. And this is not to say that you shouldn't be doing planning and budgeting and coming up with goals and metrics and tracking your management against these things. You should be doing all those things. What I'm suggesting is you shouldn't pollute that process by saying you're going to tie your planning goals to the compensation goals. You're going to get, with clients that I had that are on value sharing plans, when they propose their plans to the board of directors, I'm as likely to get, or they're as likely to get a response of, wow, this is pretty aggressive. You think you can do that? As they are, no, this is, we have some other questions about this. Maybe you can do better.
So what are the key measures in a value sharing plan?
Value sharing plan guarantees you're going to have one measure. Okay, you can have budget-based plans with a single measure, but if you're going to have a value sharing plan, it's one measure. It's almost always a measure of profitability. And you're saying we're going to give management, the stylized version is X% of the growth and profit. There are actually a lot of bells and whistles. A value sharing plan is every bit as difficult to implement as a budget-based plan. The good news is you only have to do it once every few years. I'm going to get back to that in a second. So these are standards. They got other standards, double triggers, no tax gross ups, et cetera. And let me suggest that the way they get these standards is they survey their clients. They ask their clients, their institutional investors, what do you think we should be looking at? I've talked to dozens of institutional investors. I help work with them to develop better standards. And they all say the same thing. They say, we're not in the business of creating standards. We rely on the proxy advisors to do that. The proxy advisors who are asking them what the standards should be. Okay, does that sound like a little bit of a circular business model? This is a taste of the research that I've used that's behind all the findings that we've discussed. These 2 pages, this is just the top level of the research. There's a lot of other research that's fed into this research that could probably duplicate 6 more pages like this. And that's the type of research that can lead you to a result like this, where if you do these practices, or if you invest in companies that do these practices, you'll have alpha. Let me show you the research that stands behind proxy advisor. Okay. And I swear, I stretched to get this. 2 of these studies, the Bebchuk study and the Gomper studies, which are excellent studies, don't even address compensation governance. They address other parts of governance. So with this type of research standing behind your standards, how do you suspect investors are going to fare by following your recommendations? Well, GMI and ISS were particularly transparent. And in GMI's case, if you invested in the bad companies, or if you sold the bad companies, which was blue line, and you invested in the good companies, which is the red dotted line, you would make the money equivalent to the space between those two. ISS rolled out CGQ in a very big way. It was very transparent. You could have seen it on Yahoo. How many people remember CGQ? It was everywhere. If you were looking up a company in a summary, CGQ was on there. It was a brilliant marketing move to put them on the map. And because it was out there, academics took a look at how CGQ fared. So if we invested in CGQ companies that were good governance and sold the companies that were bad governance, you would have ended up with the difference between those, and it's negative. And in fact, this type of research embarrassed them into giving up CGQ. It got transformed to GRID. It's now into QuickScore, which is just warmed over versions of CGQ, but with less transparency. The last reason, the third reason that your comp consultant may not be telling you, and when we finally get to a point of banality, is we actually make more money selling you 2 bonus plans instead of 1 value sharing plan, especially when the other bonus plan is a budget-based plan that needs our attention every single year. Now, I'm not saying this is a conspiracy. This is just simply saying that even incentive plan experts have their incentives that they're subject to. Now is my favorite part. Actually, right before we get to this, let me see how much time we have. We got a little time. Good. I'm glad. I actually prefer the Q&A to my talking. Before I get to this, let me suggest that obviously if you're a private company director, you don't have to worry about the last section. With the second point with, ISS doesn't like this stuff or proxy advisors don't like this stuff. If you're on a public company board, I'm pretty sure that you have at some point, there we go, faced a situation where you had a choice between doing what you thought was the right thing for the shareholders or doing something that looked good for the proxy advisors. How many people have found themselves in that position at some point? If you're on a public company board, it's almost inevitable, okay? What do? I mean, it's kind of hard, right? I mean, your duty of loyalty says that if you've got a conflict between yourself and the shareholders, you're supposed to resolve it in favor of the shareholders. So do you take a risk on being named and shamed to avoid doing the right thing for the shareholders? Something to think about. I provide the recommendations. I don't make judgments.